Hey everybody, Brandon here. Today we're going to be talking about how to choose intensity metrics. And when I say intensity metrics, we're talking about choosing the variables that determine how heavy you go on any one training day. Some of the metrics that we're going to talk about are percentage of 1 rep max, probably the most common. We're going to talk about velocity-based training, RPE, and reps in reserve, and any others that might come to mind because you can potentially lump AMRAPs and things like that into there, though those are not probably as popular as the ones that we're going to discuss. So when we look at intensity metrics, there are certain benefits to some. Some are simpler than others, and some require a little bit more skill set, and others even require the intervention of technology, such as with velocity-based training. With intensity metrics, I kind of like to think of them in two separate categories. We have our objective metrics, and we have our subjective metrics. We're going to spend a little bit of time on the objective ones to begin with. The first is going to be percentage of 1 rep max. Everybody is familiar with this metric. It's probably the one that most beginners should start out on, and it's one that can be somewhat consistent for the majority of individuals. Now, the reason that you wouldn't use percentage of 1 rep max is if you don't have an accurate max to base your training percentages off of. If you took a max, 6 months ago, that's probably not the most reliable number. So what people end up doing is they actually take a percentage of a percentage. They'll say, I'm going to use my max, maybe it's 500 pounds, and I'm going to take 90% of that, and that's going to be my training max. You may have heard people talk about training maxes in the past. The reason that people use training maxes is to account for any errors or differences of preparation or fatigue throughout the course of a training block. The reason that percentage of 1 rep max isn't that popular these days, people tend to go more towards RPE and reps in reserve, is because over time they become less and less reliable. Now, there are different ways to use percentages if you have the system set up correctly. Here at Kabuki Strength, we use something called percentage of last occurrence. So in our training logs, instead of starting with a percentage of 1 rep max, we might start someone on week 1 with an RPE or a reps in reserve range, and then the following week we might kill that and we'll go with a percentage increase from that. And that seems to be pretty effective for the majority of people, but it's not always the best. It really depends on the person and even their personality, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Now, if you are going to use percentage of 1 rep max, it's likely that you have some program that utilizes that in a linear fashion or maybe even an undulating fashion. These programs tend to be really, really effective, but they are pretty restrictive. They don't account for, or rather, they don't allow for a whole lot of variability in terms of your preparation or even how well you're tolerating fatigue. I think most people have done like a 5x5 base progression. Sometimes those utilize percentage of 1 rep max, sometimes they don't, but inevitably at some point in your week 3, 4, or 5, it starts to become harder and harder to hit those sets of 5. And then when you miss, you don't really have any recourse or any plan to kind of progress from that. So that's one of the biggest limitations of percentage of 1 rep max. Now, the benefits of percentage of 1 rep max is you have a plan for the day, you know exactly what you need to do, and it tends to be very, very simple. And a lot of people like that simplicity. They like the feeling of accomplishment of hitting that percentage of 1 rep max and then kind of moving on. There's not a whole lot of, well, I could have gone heavier or maybe I should have gone lighter. The plan is kind of the plan, and it's up to you to be able to execute that. Now, with percentage of 1 rep max, I happen to think there is a better way to use those if you have the means to. And a better or an improvement of percentage of 1 rep max is actually using your percentage of 1 rep max with velocity. Velocity, a lot of people think of speed training, or they think you have to move fast in order to do it. But velocity is just a measurement of displacement, and you can measure everything from 1% of your 1 rep max, which you probably wouldn't do, all the way up to 100% or even above 100% if you happen to fail a rep. Velocity is very, very useful because it is also an objective indicator. It'll tell you exactly how fast the bar moves, and you can correlate that to your percentage of 1 rep max with something that we refer to as a velocity profile. Everybody's velocity profile is slightly different, though common exercise exercises will have similar profiles. So the majority of people's squat profile will all kind of be within the similar range, though very advanced lifters, the majority of them are typically really good at grinding heavy weights. That's kind of a skill of your more qualified lifters. Those individuals typically have slightly slower profiles. It's a representation of their ability to express force over a greater amount of time. For newer lifters, we typically see velocity profiles that are a little bit faster. They're not really that good at sticking with heavy weights, and we typically see their profiles get a little bit slower over time, which is not a bad thing for a strength athlete. If you are a power athlete or a sport athlete, that probably wouldn't be ideal unless you were in a position like an offensive lineman or something like that that wasn't completely power dominant. Now, one of my favorite ways to use velocity is within ranges. We find that it's pretty tough for people to hit a single percentage of velocity right on the nose, and they typically bounce above it and below it, and they don't really know which to count and which to not count as working sets. So we simplify it, and we typically use ranges of about 5%. Now, you can use larger ranges if you prefer. If you use larger ranges, I would only do so maybe like the off season if you're a strength athlete, or if you're doing more hypertrophy based exercises, or if you have your squat profile and you want to use it for something like a front squat. Because those profiles aren't the exact same, it's usually a good idea to provide just a little bit more wiggle room so that you can actually hit within the intended load that you want for that day. The other thing that velocity can do is measure fatigue. We can look at how quickly you start your session, and we can see how much your velocity has dropped through that session. That gives us a marker for how much fatigue has been generated through that training session. And we mentioned that there's a very tight correlation to fatigue accumulation with your velocity, and that's only possible to view if we actually have a velocity profile. Now, we can say you don't have to have a velocity profile necessarily to use velocity. You can just record your progress with velocity. The way that you would do that is in any given session, you would record what your top set was or what you felt like was your best set. You would record the velocity. I prefer to record the first rep. Some people like to record the average over a set. Some people like to record the last rep. I happen to think that recording the first rep is better because there's less noise in the data. If you were to record the average of a set, you would have to consider then how many reps per set you're doing, because that would change based on if you were doing 5 reps or 7 reps, for example. Some people like to record the last rep, but you still run into the same problem. Your last rep will be quite a bit different if you're performing a set of 10 versus a set of 5. However, your first rep should be really consistent, and that provides a good marker for progress over time. If you record your first rep velocity from week 1 to week 2 to 3, you'll start to see a trend even if you don't increase your weights. You'll either start to see velocity increase for the same weight. Maybe it slowly increases as you increase weight. That's a really, really good marker of adaptation, and that's what we look for. Velocity is really, really useful because we can tell how strong you're getting without actually testing a new 1 rep max or a new rep max. We can look at the first rep velocity of any set and compare that to something similar over time, and that's going to give us a marker to tell you if you are improving or regressing. And even if your velocity moves slower, it doesn't necessarily mean you are regressing, but it might mean that you're carrying a little bit more fatigue than is intended or is intended, because the other thing you have to realize is that through the course of a training block, the intention is to promote more and more fatigue to hopefully continue to provide an adaptable stimulus for your body. Now, with velocity, I also mentioned that you could manage training load, or you can see how fatigued you are becoming. With that, if you are savvy enough with your programming, I don't necessarily recommend this for everybody. I've had somewhat mixed results with this method, but you can actually provide a velocity loss as a metric for fatigue that you want to generate in a session, and that would replace the need for you to record how many sets you're doing. So instead of saying, I'm going to do 5 sets of 6 at say 0.5 to 0.45 meters per second, which again is about a 5% range, you would then say, I'm going to continue to do sets until my first rep velocity or my average or my last rep, depending on how you want to do it, reaches a predetermined level of fatigue. If your range is a 0.5 to a 0.45, we would say, well, if I want to generate about 5% fatigue or somewhere between 5 to 10% fatigue, my first rep velocity should fall outside of that range down to maybe a 0.4 meters per second. Depending on how fatigued you are going into that training session, that could happen sooner or it could happen later. Now, where I've had mixed results with this type of method is if you don't record your rest periods really tightly, or for other reasons, such as your training week. If you just squatted a couple days before and then you go to squat again, sometimes the velocity loss becomes a little bit weird because you are a little bit sore and fatigued. But what you need to do, the number one thing you need to do if you want to use this method is keep a consistent rest period. The longer you rest, the more the fresher you'll feel going into the next set. But if that's inconsistent, say one set you only rest for 2 minutes, maybe you had to rush for some reason, and the next set you rested for 5 minutes, that 5-minute rest period will look like you aren't generating as much fatigue, and similarly the 2-minute rest period will look like you're generating a whole lot of fatigue. But in reality, it's really only intra-set fatigue because you are rushing between sets, and that's where you can get a little bit of noise with your velocity feedback. So it's a really interesting concept to manage training volume, but I found it somewhat inconsistent. If you want to train for strength, I encourage you to use a tighter velocity loss. And if you want to train for hypertrophy, I would encourage you to have a lower velocity loss, or I guess a higher velocity loss, depending on how you look at it, a greater percentage of velocity loss for hypertrophy. All right, that covers objective indicators. Now let's talk about subjective indicators or subjective factors, depending on how you want to discuss it. Subjective indicators are quite a bit different than our objective ones. Instead of providing like a very clear do this or here's the result of what you did, they require the user to be a little bit more introspective and ask a question about the performance of a set. Subjective indicators include things like RPE and reps in reserve, and those two things are pretty much the same thing, though there are some nuances to it that we'll discuss here in just a moment. Subjective indicators are more beneficial in some aspects than objective indicators because you can use them for all exercises. You can't use percentage of 1 rep max for something like a dumbbell bench press unless you know what your max is. Most people don't because it's not really a good use of time. And you can't really use velocity for accessory movements or machine exercises or even exercises that don't have a velocity profile, such as an overhead press if you are someone who typically bench presses. You typically wouldn't use velocity for things like Romanian deadlifts and things of that nature, or even good mornings either. Now, your subjective indicators like RPE are really beneficial for scaling across all exercises. Though I will say one of the drawbacks is that they become a little bit less reliable the lighter you go, and you could make an argument that you shouldn't really be going super light or spending too much time away from failure in most of your training, and that would probably be true. But subjective indicators, the farther you get from failure, the less reliable they get and the more murky the waters become. Now, when we use subjective indicators, it does require a little bit of experience. And some people aren't really fit, in my experience, to use them. We've worked with all kinds of athletes here at Kabuki Strength, and one thing that we found is that some athletes are a little bit more aggressive in their training. They really strive to like win the training session, and they want to push themselves as hard as they can. And that's all well and good, and that's the majority of lifters, I would say, in some sense or another. But those individuals who are a little bit too aggressive in their training typically overshoot their RPE or their reps in reserve, and they don't really get a good feedback loop for how well they're actually performing. Now, individuals who are a little bit more introspective and can be objective about their performance, those individuals typically do really well with RPE or reps in reserve. I typically don't like giving beginner athletes or lifters RPE or reps in reserve, because not a lot of beginners know what really hard training is. And so once they start to feel like things are getting a little hard, they might rate it as a 9 or a 10, which would be the higher levels of load or effort that they would be exposed to, when in reality it might only be like an 8 RPE or 3 reps in reserve. So if you have a beginner lifter that you're working with, it's usually useful for them to follow a percentage-based training plan, or maybe even something based on like an AMRAP progression. And then you can ask them to record their RPE per session or per set. That'll get them accustomed to rating their performance and how much fatigue is being generated, and it begins to provide a bit more of a feedback loop for that individual. For more advanced lifters, as long as they've had some exposure to RPEs or reps in reserve, it's usually a good idea to use them in some aspects of their training. And for the most advanced lifters, think about like the Chris Duffins of the world, the guys who are competing at the highest levels. In my experience, it really comes down to their own personality. Some lifters, like your Chris Duffins, are on that more aggressive side. They want to take that reach goal every session if they think it's there. Those individuals, I've found, don't really respond that well to RPE training. And it's not so much that they don't respond well to that, they just don't stay consistent enough within their load parameters as the program is intended to be. Now let's talk a little bit more about the differences of RPE versus reps in reserve. And they're basically the same thing, just inverted. RPEs work on a scale of usually it's about a 6 to 10, whereas a 10 is about a 10 of 10 effort, or you have no reps left in the tank. Sometimes you might be able to add 5 pounds, but you certainly should not be able to do another rep if you rate it as a 10. And a 9 would be about 1 rep left in the tank, and it follows that progression downward. Reps in reserve, on the other hand, are going to be the inverse of that. They're going to be a 0 is 0 reps in the tank, a 1 is 1 rep left in the tank, and a 2 is 2 reps left in the tank. I tend to think that that's a little bit more intuitive, and that's why we use that for our lifters here at Kabuki Strength. Our lifters typically use some mix of percentages or maybe velocity. If they have a device, they'll use what I mentioned earlier, and that would be a percentage of their last occurrence, or typically that's like a percentage of last week's performance. And then for things like accessory exercises, they might use RPE, or rather reps in reserve. And when we use reps in reserve, I think most people can utilize them better if they have some historical data that they can view. So if you're using RPEs or reps in reserve, it's really helpful to have a logbook with you to see what you've done in the past in terms of loading for that specific exercise, rep, and RPE combination. If you keep a logbook with you that has the data that the loads that you've done previously, it gives you kind of a target for that day. And I found that that's really useful. That's how all of our lifters use reps in reserve, is in their training logs. As they add data to it, it starts to record it over time, and it'll display their average best that they've done within a certain range. And that gives them a target for the day, and once they've gotten to that target, then they defer more to the reps in reserve, and then they can utilize that more so than just the target load if they're a lifter that we're utilizing RPE heavy for. Now, I mentioned we use reps in reserve a little bit more than RPE here at Kabuki Strength, and the reason is really just personal preference. I typically like to use a range of reps in reserve for our athletes, and it's usually about a 5% range of load. So for our athletes, we might give them a 1 to 2 reps in reserve, and that would be leave either 1 rep in the tank or 2 reps left in the tank, or it'll be a 2 to 3, a 0 to 1, or a 3 to 5. Again, once you get farther from failure, your ranges typically open up, and that's why we give them a 3 to 5 versus just a 1 to 2 or 2 to 3. We still will provide them with load ranges. Sometimes we'll make an educated guess, but if the athlete has historic data, we'll always display that for them to make the best load decision that they can. We also find that giving athletes a little bit of a range in their training doesn't really change the training effect. I don't think you have to, in my experience anyway, unless you're working with the most most qualified of athletes, which even then I think you could make an argument for using a wider range because we've had success with them. But we found that having a wider range of load targets for an athlete on any given training session or exercise actually gives them a little bit more freedom, and it gives them a little bit more autonomy. So if they aren't feeling quite as sharp on a day, maybe they're feeling a little bit of fatigue, they can typically work to the lower end of the range and still remain on plan versus having to go up to that higher end of the range and kind of forcing the issue with them. So which method should you use? Now, this is just my best recommendation. I typically recommend novices or beginners, and I would consider a novice or beginner someone who's either new to training or maybe they've trained for a little while but they haven't been on a structured plan and they haven't made a lot of progress. Those individuals I would consider more novice. As I previously mentioned, typically percentage-based training plans are pretty effective for those individuals. They can use RPEs, but I personally prefer to have them record their RPE versus just basing their load off of it. I mentioned that novices typically don't know what really hard training is, and so it's usually not a great idea for them to use an RPE because they don't really know what hard is, and even if they do, oftentimes their technical limitations are the thing that limits them, not even their strength. For intermediate athletes, they can kind of use anything. If they've had exposure to reps and reserve training or RPE training, it's totally good to go and we'll use it for them. If they have consistent motor paths and they can execute their technique well, then they're a great candidate for velocity-based training. And we'll still use percentages for them, but more often we'll use a percentage of last occurrence versus a percentage of 1 rep max for that individual. And finally, for our more advanced guys, our highly qualified athletes, your Chris Duffins and guys like that, in my experience, it really comes down to their personality and preferences, because all of these factors that we've been mentioning so far all try to do the same thing, though they go about it in slightly different ways. Objective indicators I found are a little bit better for the more aggressive populations, the people who like to compete every training session and like to reach for those stretch goals or PRs per training session, because it gives them a realistic view of their performance. They don't have to be introspective. They can look at their velocity device and see exactly how quickly they moved and then make a decision based on that. I found that individuals who are a little bit more introspective, or I don't like to use the term cerebral too much, but people who like to think about the process more deeply, they're a great candidate for RPE or reps in reserve. I think Mike Teixeira describes this really well as like the considerate, aggressive person. I can't remember exactly what he used, but it's someone who can be aggressive when it's necessary, but can also pull back the reins also when it's necessary. I think that's a really tricky thing to have as a strength athlete, but it is something that is gained with greater and greater experience. Ultimately, you should explore all of these options and see which one you like the best. But with our experience here and working with a lot of athletes, I think this gets pretty close to what we would recommend for anyone at any entry point for strength training. Brandon out.